Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Our guest on this episode of the podcast is joining us long distance. Calling in from Cape Town, South Africa is Chad Weigand, Regional Director of the Sub-Sahara Africa region for U.S. Wheat Associates. Chad has been Regional Director since 2020. He has been with U.S. Wheat Associates since 2009. In his role at U.S. Wheat Associates, Chad is responsible for leading market development programs conducted in the U.S. Wheat Sub-Saharan African region to develop, serve, and expand markets for U.S. wheat exports. Well, Chad, let's start by having you review for us basically what that Sub-Sahara Africa region is. Who are the major countries and major players in that region?
Yeah, so in the Sub-Saharan Africa region, we cover 42 countries in total. The big players for us would be Nigeria, by far is the number one market for U.S. wheat for us. And then some of the other big players include South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Ghana. The whole region is very what I'd call price sensitive, and so it does vary quite a bit from year to year on how much wheat we see into some of these markets. But we do get consistent amounts of wheat going into Nigeria, South Africa, and the other markets that I mentioned there.
Yeah, Nigeria is quite the story. It's been a success story for U.S. Wheat Associates for probably the past couple of decades, and Nigeria on the southwest coast of Africa. So a lot of people listening to this may think, well, how in the world did a relationship get established where a lot of hard red winter or especially hard white wheat ends up going from Kansas to Nigeria? So take us back a little bit in time and tell us how that market relationship was set up.
It goes back quite a ways. Before my time here in the Cape Town office, my predecessors, they established and worked in the market through an office we had in Lagos and working with, I believe it started first with noodles and using hard white with the instant noodles. And noodles are quite a staple in the Nigerian market, the instant noodles. And so it's one of the biggest products there. And that's kind of initially how it took off. And the mills were using hard white for some of that noodle production. They also use it for some of their more traditional foods. One is what they call a ball food. Not a very imaginative name, but it's used for dipping into sauces. Some of the traditional foods you get in Nigeria with fish stews, beef and chicken stews, and they'll use the ball food to dip into that. That's also been made with hard white. And a lot of it is appealing because of the color hard white. You get the same or very similar characteristics with the hard red winter wheat, but you get better color with hard white for these products, lower ash content, increased extraction rates, etc. when you use hard white. And so that, in a nutshell, is kind of where that market kind of took off. And back when that market did take off, the Black Sea still was not a major player in the wheat export market. And so the Nigerian market really relied on the U.S. and hard winter, hard white imports. And since then, though, unfortunately, I think we all know a bit of the story, but the Black Sea has kind of taken over a bit of that market, just purely based on price, some of that cheaper wheat going into Nigeria. Also, when you look at hard white, Australian white wheat production is taken over or intruded on the hard white markets in Nigeria, just because, again, price, accessibility, availability, where some years in hard white, it's not extremely available depending on the production. Fortunately, it has been increasing the hard white winter wheat production. You probably know this better than I do, but the past couple of years it's been back on the downtrend. But we did see a good increase for about 5 years, and we saw Nigeria import a record amount of hard white wheat going back to 2 or 3 years ago now.
When the peak of success, there were a couple of technical people. Late Jim McKenna was a friend of both of ours. What was Jim doing? He was stationed in Lagos. Is that correct?
No, Jim was actually stationed here in our Cape Town
right.
office. Yeah, Muiwa was based in our Lagos office. But Jim, he traveled all over the region, did quite a lot of very good work for U.S. wheat and helping to establish these markets and getting the buyers to one, get the recognized the value and quality that they were getting from wheat from the U.S., primarily hard red winter and hard white. But so being able to recognize that value that they were getting and using it properly, and that technical assistance that he provided to them really boosted the relationship, provided for consistent demand for U.S. wheat into that market.
How large at one point was U.S. wheat's market share in Nigeria?
We got, I want to say about 3.2 million tons was the high from the U.S. At the peak, and that's going back probably about 15 years now. Nigeria, the market has grown quite a bit, reaching a peak of 6.2 million tons in 2020. But since then, their wheat imports have actually declined a bit the past couple of years, and that's due to a number of reasons. Lower demand, primarily because of economic factors, but then also the supply chain with COVID interruptions and whatnot. We saw a shift towards increased corn consumption and rice and cassava at the expense of wheat. And so last year, it was a 4.7 million ton market compared to the 6.2 million tons in 2020. So we've seen a decline in Nigeria as far as overall wheat consumption goes. I'm hoping that should rebound, but I think it's going to take a little bit. They're going through some extremely tough economic times right now. The Nigerian naira is devalued over 50% in the past year. And so, a year ago for $1, you're able to get 450 naira. Now, $1 gets you 950 naira. So that makes the imports that much more expensive for the Nigerian flour mills. And because of those costs, they've shifted more towards local products. Sub-Saharan Africa, wheat, countries are dependent over 80% for wheat. They're dependent on imports. Whereas corn, they're only dependent on about 20% for imports to meet consumption. So because of that, we've seen that shift in these difficult economic times where the shift has gone to crops such as corn and rice at the expense of wheat.
Yeah, Nigeria is an interesting country as far as economics are concerned. They get a lot of their income from oil. It's really strange. Nigeria exports a lot of oil, but they don't refine any of that oil, right? They have to import all their gasoline.
That is correct. They are a major exporter of crude oil and a major importer of refined oil, gasoline. So it's ironic. They're dependent almost 90% on oil for their foreign exchange, which creates quite a dependency on what oil prices are doing as far as the availability of Forex for the Nigerian market. And so you got to pay attention to what those oil prices are doing, because that's going to impact on how much the mills can import. And again, that just contributes to the price sensitivity. If they have the lack of Forex, then they're going to look at whatever's the cheapest wheat. And we've seen a lot of that happening in the past couple of years because of these economic conditions.
Governments also tend to intervene in other ways, whether good or bad, and it's also the way in Nigeria. They've a couple instances there where it's affected, I believe, how buyers can get credit.
The issue would be the letter of credit and getting a guarantee on the credit, and that's become increasingly difficult because with the devaluation of the naira, their foreign reserves shrink as well, and that happens with the companies that are looking to guarantee the letter of credit. Their profits decrease, their cash on hand has less value on the international market, and so it becomes increasingly difficult for them to obtain a letter of credit, and the financing becomes that much more difficult. Interest rates in Nigeria have also increased quite a bit, from about 12% in 2020 to about 19% now. So you can imagine that's quite an economic toll, and has a huge impact on the mills and their operations.
We occasionally hear a story out of Nigeria, too, depending upon who's in charge of the government, about local sustaining of food, being able to grow wheat locally, or in some cases, cassava is a local crop, and the government mandating that a certain portion of cassava be blended into wheat flour to support local farmers. So how do all those things stand right now?
That initiative is still in place as far as Nigeria trying to become self-sufficient in wheat production. So, we talked a little bit about the numbers. Nigeria had a demand of 6.2 million tons in 2020, still has about 4.5 to 5 million tons of demand, and they're only producing 150,000 tons on a good year right now. So that's a huge deficit that they have to make up. There's a lot of problems. Security-wise, I would say in Nigeria is one where the major wheat producing areas are in the north part of the country where there's a lot of instability, political instability. Security remains an issue that really kind of prevents that area from taking off what its full potential could be. However, even with its full potential, I don't think it's even going to come close to meeting the demands for Nigeria being a 6 million ton market. In addition to that, the distribution of the seeds, the farming technology, they don't get the yields. The yields they're getting right now, if you look at USDA's number, about 15 bushels per acre. You can imagine, I'm sure there's a lot of producers there in Kansas who would be shocked to hear 15 bushels per acre. That's a very bad year. Actually, the past 2 years, maybe that has happened with the drought, but
that has happened.
On a regular basis, that's on a very bad year in Kansas, a typical year in Nigeria. And so the feasibility, I just don't think is there for Nigeria to become self-sufficient in wheat. I think my personal opinion, I think they'd be better off focusing on other crops like corn, where the region the country itself is much more, the conditions are much more prone to corn production, beneficial for corn production as opposed to wheat. And I think they'd be better off trying to develop that market and looking at trying to export some of the corn to some of the neighboring countries there. Yeah, so I don't think the Nigerian wheat production is something that's going to be obtained anytime soon. I think it's all more about political talk. The idea of, it's a good theme, I would say, for political parties to talk about. On the cassava, I've talking to the mills there about cassava. The problem with that is that they just don't have the production of cassava that they need or would need to reach the government mandates on cassava. The government wants about between 5 to 10% of their flour to contain cassava, but they just don't have the production to meet that requirement. And, on the one hand, it's essentially not enforced, the cassava issue right now, because Nigeria doesn't have the production to enforce that. Nigeria doesn't have the production to make it feasible to reach those demands of the government. But hypothetically, if they did, cassava doesn't have gluten. So if you're baking a loaf of bread, and in the Nigerian market, volume is king. They want the biggest bread loaves you can get. So if you're replacing 10% of that flour with something that doesn't have gluten, you're going to need much better quality wheat. And that's something where the U.S. could actually, I think, be a potential benefit to the U.S. market or for our U.S. wheat exports, being able to provide that higher protein quality, the content and the quality from our hard red winter and hard red spring crops. But that being said, the cassava issue right now is kind of on the back burner, not as being enforced at the moment, because Nigeria doesn't have the production of cassava to meet those quotas that the government has implemented.
Well, that's good to hear. And another thing that has evolved over the past 10 years, and it's the industry in the U.S. is not immune to this either, of the evolving of the milling industry, mergers, changes in ownership. And we've seen a little bit of that in Nigeria compared to what it used to be 15 years ago. Most of the players were, in fact, Nigeria-owned companies, but that has changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has. Right now, I'd say we look at it as essentially 4 major milling groups: flour mills in Nigeria, Olam, Dufil Flour Milling, Bua Group. Yeah, the market has definitely consolidated over the past decade, I would say. Honeywell used to be one of the major milling companies. Flour mills in Nigeria purchased them about 2 years ago. Flour Mills of Nigeria, their parent company is based out of New York. You have the Olam Group, where a lot of their trading is done out of Dubai and Singapore. The BUA Group is owned by a company in London called NAM UK. And the Dufil company, their headquarters is also based out of Singapore. And so that just does make things difficult, I think, as far as when we do our marketing activities and promotion, getting everyone on the same page. When you have the milling and quality analysis going on in Lagos, Nigeria, but then you have the procurement coming out of London, Singapore, or New York, it definitely creates a challenge for everyone to get on the same page and look at the value that U.S. wheat can provide. The procurement staff always wants to look at the bottom line price. What is this going to cost me today? The milling and quality staff, they've got different priorities. They want, things that meet their specifications, things that give you the higher extraction rates, or the things that have the better protein functionality. So that's something that we're trying to work on, and through our marketing activities is a lot of what we call the Contracting for Wheat Value seminars, where we try and get all three of those groups, from procurement, milling, and quality, all on the same page to look at the value you're getting. And so while the procurement staff might have to pay $10 per metric ton more for this wheat, they're getting the better functionality out of the protein or the better extraction rates. So looking at the overall value. And so that's been a big plan. Part of our marketing plan is how do we get those three areas all together to see the overall value of U.S. wheat and not just look at today's FOB price. Especially today, and you're well aware in Kansas that hard red winter, the drought has caused a significant impact on what our supplies are and what we're able to export. And we've had a huge decline as a result in our hard red winter exports going to Nigeria. So, I'm optimistic. I think we're all a little bit optimistic that this year, 2024, will be a bit better for hard red winter. And hopefully we get back there and are a little more competitive as far as global prices go. Right now, though, we're looking at $30 to $50 premiums for hard red winter compared to comparable wheat out of the Black Sea or the EU. And so we're seeing a lot of that come into our markets in Nigeria and our East Africa, West Africa, and South Africa markets as well. But yeah, so we're looking quite a bit at contracting for wheat value to identify the value you can get from U.S. wheat. And that's not always just about the bottom line price.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say things used to be a lot easier when all those decisions were centralized in Nigeria, and I think the purchasing was based more on relationships and reputation back then too, and things have certainly changed. Before we move on from Nigeria, let's talk once about hard white winter wheat. There's been a good, as you mentioned, pipeline between Kansas and Nigeria. How do you see that moving forward? I know things are always changing there too. We haven't had the supply of hard white wheat because of the drought the last 3 years, but what's the future look like?
The bottom line is, if we had the supply of hard white wheat, my job would be a lot easier. Hard white is always in demand. Prior to working in this region, I worked in the Mexico region, and always got questions about hard white, and the demand was there. And that's the same with this market. We've got mills in South Africa, the mills in Nigeria. They would all be interested in buying hard white. The problem is the supply and the price, especially the past couple of years. It just hasn't been competitive. The supply's gone down, and so we haven't seen the hard white sales in the past couple of years like we did about 2-3 years ago. The 2021-2022 marketing year, we set a record with hard white sales at 225,000 tons. And so the demand is always there. It's just a matter of the availability and the pricing. In Nigeria, especially right now with the conditions, the economic conditions that we've kind of talked about, that the mills are experiencing, similar to U.S., and one of the things that's prevented hard white wheat from taking off is the cost of segregating the wheat. The country elevators don't want it. They have to segregate it, so they charge a discount to the farmer, so then that discourages the farmer from producing it. The same thing is sort of happening in Nigeria, where there's a cost to segregating that wheat, whether it's through the price of the wheat, the storage of the wheat, the logistics, if you need a separate vessel, or a separate hold to ship the quantities. And so because of those economic conditions in Nigeria, they've decreased their use of hard white in the past couple of years. It's just based on the economics and supply of it right now. It's not based on the quality of it. I'd say the demand is still there. It just has to be feasible. The supply has to be feasible. Price has to be reasonable.
I know our farmers are working on growing more of that, and it's off to a better start than it has been the past couple of years. Well, Chad, let's move on down the coast a little bit to where you are in South Africa. And South Africa has frankly been a tough nut to crack for hard red winter wheat from Kansas. So brief us on that marketplace and what they're looking for and what the opportunities are for not just hard red winter wheat, but for other classes of wheat from the United States.
In South Africa, as you said, it has been a tough nut to crack with the hard red winter. It, again, I think is a price-sensitive market when it comes to that particular class of wheat. One thing we are trying to do, we are promoting hard white here. As we speak, actually, we have 4 containers sitting at Premier Milling here in South Africa of hard white samples that we're going to mill. We're actually bringing Sean Teeley from IGP over to South Africa to help mill that. And so that's one of the areas we're trying to promote. And again, I think there's been a lot of talk and a lot of hope and optimism that hard white is something that the mills can use here. This is coming from the mills that they can use here in South Africa. And so again, I think if the production's there, it's a feasible alternative. The supply is good enough to bring in for import. The demand is there. So that is one area we're working on with the mills here in South Africa. We've also been doing a lot of work with soft red winter, looking at some of the niche markets for biscuits, cookies, and crackers. There is one company that does buy a regular supply of soft red winter, and we're looking to hopefully expand that. I think here also the expansion of some fast food chains has brought in opportunities that could help increase demands for some of these, what I call niche markets, and some of the demand for classes of wheat that you can't necessarily get from Black Sea or EU. Those being the hard whites, the soft red winters, to some extent hard red spring as well for the higher protein wheat. That's some of the work we've done. We've been doing some work at the Wheat Marketing Center on doing blends for soft red winter, also with cake flour. Currently, the market here uses basically an all-purpose flour for their cakes, and as an American living here in South Africa, it's quite a disappointment that they use the all-purpose flour for cakes. They're not very tasty.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll try. Well, remember that next time you visit, we'll get you some good stuff. Talk about possible emerging markets in your region.
I would say emerging markets, we're focusing quite a bit on East Africa and Kenya, Tanzania, and trying to do more work with them. Again, I think there's opportunity for some lower protein wheat going into chapati and mandazi. Chapati is a flatbread that is very popular and common in Kenya and Tanzania. And then mandazi is kind of like a doughy sort of, almost like a samosa, if you know what that is, but not quite as savory, a little more sweet. Yeah, I don't know.
You don't know how to describe it?
Compare it. An empanada, you know an empanada?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So mandazi is sort of kind of like a empanada that you would see in some of our Latin American markets, where it's kind of a smaller kind of dough ball that you could stuff with a filling of, say, meat, chicken. Those are very common products in Tanzania and Kenya. And I think there's good opportunities to, one, use soft red winter in some of their blends. They currently use primarily wheat from the Black Sea, especially prior to the Russian-Ukraine conflict. They were buying quite a bit out of Russia for those products. And I think there's opportunities where they can use even lower protein, soft red, even soft white for those products. Definitely a lower pro hard red winter would be very good for those products. So we're working a lot with them now on looking at blends that they can incorporate to help reduce their input costs. So if it's using a soft red winter that tends to be cheaper than a hard wheat, if they can do that, then if it helps them lower their production costs, then it could be a benefit to the U.S. and help increase demand for that class. Let's see, one thing we're also doing quite a bit of work on is the solvent retention capacity, and doing training with that, looking at protein functionality as opposed to just the protein content and quantity. So you're looking at like what the protein quality is as opposed to just the protein quantity. That gives the millers an opportunity again to lower their input costs. If they're oftentimes, I would say the procurements of wheat, they kind of put just a steady, almost blind protein number, like the same protein specification over and over. You know, you look especially at our hard red winter crop quality data, if you go back and look at the numbers, you still get very good low volume even when our hard red winter protein is lower. And so rather than just putting that blind spec of, say, 12% down, can you use 11%, 11.5% protein and still get the same functionality out of it, perhaps even better than what you would get? And so if the millers can look at that and decrease their specification, protein often comes at a premium. So if they're able to look at a little bit lower protein content, then that can help them save on their production costs. And oftentimes when U.S. wheat is not the cheapest wheat, it could help them look at perhaps a lower price coming out of the U.S. than what they usually would buy at. So we're working quite a bit in East Africa, actually across the region. We're working on that program, whether it's Nigeria, East Africa, South Africa. I also see opportunities for emerging markets in West Africa, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. I think there's, again, good opportunities. A lot of those countries, especially the French-speaking West African countries, the baguette is their standard, their staple. And there's good opportunities to incorporate hard red winter, lower protein hard red winter into those baguettes. It's just a matter of us having the supply and not being at $50 premiums.
Yeah,
to the EU.
yeah.
But, you know, I think those are some areas where there's potential in the future for us to do some work and create some demand for U.S. wheat from those markets.
Does food aid open some doors for you in some of those markets?
Yeah, so food aid, actually Food for Progress, we just had a sale into Tanzania that was sold in December, will be arriving in March. And this was under Food for Progress, so the mills still have to pay for the wheat, but they pay for it at a bit of a discounted price. And this definitely, especially in today's market where our prices are definitely much higher than the global prices, you know, it lets us sell some wheat to a market where otherwise we wouldn't have. And it gets a lot of the mills in these areas don't have too much experience working with U.S. wheat. And so if the mill is able to get some U.S. wheat through food aid, then that gives them that experience using U.S. wheat. And I never hear complaints about U.S. wheat. When they get it, they know what they're getting, they're always happy with the quality that they get. And yeah, so I think the food aid definitely opens some channels into some markets where otherwise we wouldn't be able to get wheat in there. Yeah, we also, a couple of years ago, we did a food aid shipment to Kenya, about 90,000 tons. And again, that was a time right when global wheat prices had taken off, and it's business that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do because our hard red winter prices were too uncompetitive on the global market.
We certainly appreciate everything you're doing over there in that region for Kansas farmers and U.S. wheat farmers. And is there anything else you wanted to add?
Hard red winter has an excellent reputation globally. It's the buyers, they know what they're getting with it. It's consistent, and consistency is one of the number one priorities. One of the top priorities for the milling industry is consistency. And also the hard white, there's definitely demand out there. If we have the supply, there's the demand.
My thanks to Chad Weigand with U.S. Wheat Associates for joining us on this episode of the podcast. Remember, if you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at podcast@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.